She slipped his phone from the nightstand while he slept. Not because she was suspicious. She wasn't, not yet. She just wanted to check the time. But the screen lit up with a message notification, and the name on it stopped her cold. Sabrina, she has no idea. She trusts me more than anyone. 5 months pregnant, still wearing the oversized shirt she'd stolen from her husband's closet, Elara Vale stood barefoot in the dark and read those 11 words 3 times before her legs remembered how to hold her up. Her best friend, her husband, and a secret they had been keeping together. If you've ever trusted someone completely, given them the most fragile parts of yourself, and then discovered they had been laughing at you the whole time, you already know what happened next inside Elara's chest. And if you haven't, you're about to. Before we go further, if this is your first time on this channel, welcome. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell because we tell stories here that will make you think, make you feel, and sometimes make you want to throw your phone across the room. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't forget to like this video. Now let's go back to that dark bedroom in Manhattan, where a woman's entire world just cracked open. The photograph arrived the way most disasters do, quietly, without warning, disguised as something ordinary. It wasn't even addressed to Elara. It was just there, sitting inside a newsfeed on Damian's forgotten tablet, the way celebrity gossip always is: loud colors, bright lights, people smiling for cameras, while the rest of the world goes on, living its small, invisible life. Elara had picked up the tablet to turn off the lamp beside it. She'd been having trouble sleeping again. 6 weeks into the second trimester, her hips ached no matter which way she turned, and the Manhattan skyline outside their penthouse window had a way of glowing right through the blackout curtains they'd paid too much money for. She wasn't looking for anything. She was just tired. But she tapped the screen by accident, and the news story loaded. And there they were. Damian Vale, CEO of Vale Meridian Group, husband. The man whose name was on the penthouse lease, and the corporate stationery, and the side of her coffee mug from 3 Christmases ago, stood under a chandelier at the Hargrove Museum Gala with his hand on the small of another woman's back. Not like a colleague, not like a family friend, like someone who had memorized the geography of her spine. And the woman was Sabrina Cross. Elara put the tablet down on the coffee table. Then she picked it up again, because she thought maybe she'd misread it. Maybe the photograph was older. Maybe the caption was wrong. Maybe there was some professional explanation for the way Sabrina's head was tilted toward Damian's shoulder, the way his lips were pressed against her temple, the way both of them looked like they'd forgotten. There were cameras in the room. She read the caption 3 times. Vale Meridian CEO Damian Vale and guest Sabrina Cross at the Hargrove Museum Annual Charity Gala Friday evening. He'd told her he had a board dinner in Boston. She'd made soup for herself because she'd been craving something simple, something that felt like being taken care of, and she'd eaten it alone at the kitchen island while watching a documentary about migratory birds because Damian wasn't home. And Sabrina had said she had a work thing and couldn't come over. And Elara had thought, that's fine, I'll just have a quiet night. She'd had the quiet night. She just hadn't understood why. The baby moved. Not a kick exactly, more like a slow roll, like someone turning over in sleep. Elara pressed her palm flat against her abdomen, a reflex she'd developed in the last few weeks. Something her body did automatically now, whenever she needed to locate herself. You're here. I'm here. We're okay. Except they weren't okay. She sat down on the edge of the sofa that had taken 6 weeks to arrive from an Italian furniture maker, whose name she could never pronounce correctly, and she looked at the photograph again. And this time, she made herself look carefully, not at Damian's face, not at Sabrina's expression, at Sabrina's wrist, the bracelet. It was delicate, antique, a thin band of rose gold set with 3 oval diamonds that had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that. Elara had inherited it when her mother died 7 years ago. She'd worn it every day for 4 years until it disappeared somewhere in the chaos of moving into the penthouse. She and Sabrina had spent an entire Saturday afternoon tearing through moving boxes looking for it. Sabrina had even checked Elara's car. Elara had eventually filed a report with her insurance company and tried to accept that it was gone. It wasn't gone. It was on Sabrina's wrist, under the chandelier at the Hargrove Museum Gala, on a Friday night when Elara was eating soup alone. She thought she might be sick. She went to the bathroom not because she was actually sick, but because moving felt necessary, because sitting still with that image in her head felt like something she couldn't survive. She ran cold water over her wrists the way her mother used to do when she had a fever as a kid. And she looked at herself in the mirror, and for a long moment she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, because she felt like a stranger inside her own reflection, like the person she'd believed herself to be that morning. The person who trusted her husband and her best friend was someone else entirely. A woman who no longer existed. She'd been pregnant for 5 months, and the only people who knew were her doctor, and Sabrina. She thought about that. She thought about the night she'd called Sabrina at 11 p.m., crying and laughing at the same time, barely able to get the words out. The test was positive. Sabrina, the test was positive. Sabrina had driven to the penthouse in 20 minutes flat, still in her pajamas, and held Elara while she cried, and said, "I'm so happy for you. I'm so happy for you. You're going to be such an incredible mother." They'd sat on the kitchen floor together until almost 2 in the morning because neither of them wanted to move. Sabrina had been the one to suggest the baby shoes, small, white, wrapped in tissue paper, as the way to tell Damian. "Give them to him in the morning," she'd said. "Don't say anything. Just put them on his breakfast plate and let him figure it out." The shoes were still in a box in the bedroom closet. Elara came back out of the bathroom and sat on the floor next to the coffee table. Not the couch. The floor. She needed something solid and unyielding underneath her. She needed to not be comfortable right now. She pulled up Damian's phone. He'd left it charging on the counter, which he never did, which she'd thought was strange but hadn't asked about because she'd been trying to stop asking questions that made her seem like she was checking up on him, and she tried his passcode. It didn't work. He'd changed it. She wasn't sure when she'd last entered his passcode, probably over a year ago. She hadn't needed to. But she'd known it. In the abstract way married people know things about each other. His coffee order, his mother's birthday, his passcode. And now it was wrong. And she didn't know when he'd changed it. And she realized that she'd been so consumed with the pregnancy and the quiet and the soup on Friday night that she hadn't noticed any of it. She picked up the tablet instead. The tablet was older. A device Damian used mostly for reading industry reports, synced to his cloud account with an older password she still had because he'd given it to her 3 years ago when she'd needed to pull a contract file while he was traveling. She hadn't used it in months, but the sync was still active. She started with his calendar. The Boston board dinner was listed, but the location attached to it wasn't Boston. It was a hotel 14 blocks from the penthouse. She went back 6 months. There were 12 similar calendar entries. Meetings with labels that sounded professional but linked to personal locations, a restaurant he'd never mentioned, an address in Brooklyn she didn't recognize, twice to what appeared to be Sabrina's building. 12 times in 6 months. Her hands were shaking. She noticed it with a kind of clinical detachment, the way she'd noticed everything in the last 45 minutes steadily, precisely, like she was cataloging evidence rather than living inside the worst night of her life. She'd always been like this. Her first reaction to catastrophe was to get organized. Her therapist had told her once that it was a coping mechanism developed in childhood, probably connected to her father's illness. The years of managing everything because someone had to. You don't fall apart, Elara. You make a list. She made a list. She opened a note on the tablet and began writing down everything she found. By 2 in the morning, the list was 2 pages long. It was the bracelet that kept coming back to her. Not the photographs. Not the hotel addresses. Not even the night she'd eaten soup alone. It was the bracelet, because the bracelet had required planning. It had required Sabrina to be inside her home, inside her moving boxes, pretending to help search for something she already knew the location of. Maybe she had taken it herself. Maybe Damian had given it to her. Elara didn't know which possibility was worse. She called Gideon Rourke at 6:30 in the morning. She'd met Gideon 3 years ago at a Vale Meridian shareholder event. He was corporate litigation, the kind of attorney people hired when the problem was serious enough that they didn't want anyone local to find out about it. He had the kind of face that looked like it had heard everything twice and wasn't surprised anymore. She'd kept his number Not because she'd ever expected to need it, but because keeping numbers like his was the kind of thing her father had always told her to do. Know who to call when the fire is already burning. He answered on the second ring. Gideon. It's Elara Vale. She paused. I need to talk to you this morning.
Before the markets open.
A brief silence. Not surprised professionals like Gideon Rourke were never surprised. Just calibrating. My office. 8 o'clock. Thank you. She hung up and stood in the kitchen in the early gray light and looked at the soup pot she hadn't washed, yet still sitting in the drying rack from Friday night. She thought about throwing it. She thought about it seriously, measured the distance from the counter to the wall, calculated the noise it would make, decided against it. She washed it instead, because that was who she was. She washed the soup pot at 6:30 in the morning, after discovering her husband and her best friend had been lying to her for at least 6 months. And then she went and showered and put on real clothes and pulled her hair back. And by 7:15, she was standing in the lobby of their building, waiting for the car. The doorman said good morning. She said good morning back. She did not cry. Gideon's office was on the 42nd floor of a building on Park Avenue that looked like it had been designed specifically to make you feel that whatever problem you were walking in with was already being handled. She told him everything. She started with the tablet, walked him through the calendar entries, described the photograph, told him about the bracelet. She was precise. She didn't editorialize. She didn't cry. She presented facts in the order she'd discovered them, and when she was done, she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Gideon looked at his notepad for a moment. Tell me about the company, he said. Your involvement. From the beginning. So she did. She and Damian had met 12 years ago, when he was 31 and she was 28, and Vale Meridian was a tech startup with 11 employees and a rented office in Midtown that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. She'd been a contract negotiator then, good at her job but not extraordinary, the kind of person who could have stayed in the middle tier of the industry forever without anyone particularly noticing. What she was extraordinary at what she'd never put on a resume because she hadn't understood it was a skill yet was reading rooms. Knowing which person in the room was actually making the decision. Knowing when to push and when to let silence do the work for her. Damian had needed that. He was brilliant, genuinely brilliant, with an instinct for technology that she'd admired from the first meeting. But he was also impulsive and impatient, and had a habit of torpedoing negotiations in the final stretch because he got frustrated and said something sharp. She'd watched it happen twice in 6 months. The third time, she'd stepped in not obviously, just redirected the conversation, bought him enough time to cool down, closed the deal herself while he was getting coffee, and afterward he'd looked at her with an expression she'd seen on people who'd just realized they'd been underestimating someone. 2 years later, they were married. 4 years after that, Vale Meridian had its first billion in revenue. She'd left her own career officially around year 3, when it became clear that managing Damian's company needed more than a CEO and a board. It needed someone who understood the contracts and the relationships and the back-channel negotiations, and the moments when Damian was about to blow something up and needed to be quietly redirected. She'd become, in effect, the invisible architecture of the company, doing everything that kept the machine running smoothly, but showing up on none of the org charts. She'd made that choice. She wasn't pretending otherwise. But she'd also made it, because Damian had asked her to specifically, and because he'd said, I couldn't do any of this without you, Elara. You know that. She had believed him. Gideon was writing. He had been writing since she started talking. Do you have any documentation of your contributions? He asked. Yes, she'd known this question was coming. She'd spent part of the night, after the soup and before the tablet, and after the tablet, pulling together in her memory everything she'd kept. Contracts I negotiated, email correspondence, meeting recordings from the early years before they switched systems, testimony from 3 board members who were in the room for the deals. You thought about this ahead of time. I'm thorough, she said. I've always been thorough. Damian relied on that. She said it without bitterness, which surprised her a little. Then she realized it wasn't surprising at all. She wasn't bitter. Not yet. She was in the part of disaster management where everything was still a problem to be solved, and she was good at problems. The bitterness would come later, probably at 3 in the morning on some Tuesday, when she'd thought she'd gotten through the worst of it, and she'd deal with it then. I want to look at the company's financials, she told Gideon. All of them. I want forensic accountants who haven't worked with Vale Meridian before. Gideon put his pen down. You think there's more? I think, Elara said carefully, that a man who can hide a 6-month affair on a company calendar can hide other things in a company's books. And I think, she paused, that Sabrina Cross is involved in whatever it is. The bracelet wasn't about love. Someone who steals from a grieving daughter isn't sentimental. They're strategic. There was a long silence, Mrs. Vale. Gideon said. Quinn, she corrected. My name is Elara Quinn. I'd like to start using it again, if that's all right. He nodded. Wrote something down. Miss Quinn, he said. This is going to take time. If there's financial misconduct involved, it could get complicated. Public. I know. You're 5 months pregnant. I know that too. He looked at her for a moment. Not with pity she would have gotten up and left if she'd seen pity. With something closer to respect. Or at least the professional cousin of respect. Assessment. All right, he said. We start today. Damian's attorneys reached her at 11:30. She was in the car heading back to the penthouse to collect some documents when her phone rang. A man named Harrison Briggs from Caldwell Briggs LLP introduced himself and said he was calling on behalf of Damian Vale with a settlement proposal. He was polished, practiced, the kind of attorney who delivered bad news in the tone of a weather forecast. There was a number involved. There was also, attached to the number, a confidentiality agreement requiring her to make no public statements about the marriage, Vale Meridian Group, or any individuals connected to either. She listened to all of it. Thank you, Mr. Briggs, she said. I'll have my attorney review it, of course. We're hoping to reach an amicable. I'm sure you are, she said. Have a good morning. She hung up. The car moved through midtown traffic. She looked out the window at the street, the ordinary people, the food carts, the delivery trucks, the whole rumbling ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea what was happening inside this car, and she thought about the word amicable. Amicable. Damian had been living a double life for at least 6 months. He'd been going to the museum gala with the woman who'd held Elara's hand while she cried about her pregnancy test. He'd had attorneys on retainer, ready to call the morning after she found out, which meant he'd known she would find out eventually, which meant he'd been planning this exit for long enough to lawyer up in advance. And his opening position was amicable. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, but the message made the sender immediately clear. I'm sorry. I know you won't believe that right now. I'm sorry. She stared at Sabrina's text for a long moment. Then she locked the screen and put the phone in her bag. The documents from the early years of Vale Meridian were kept in a storage space Elara maintains separately from any of Damian's accounts. Not because she'd been planning for this, because she was organized, and because she'd known from the beginning that memory wasn't enough, that the work she did needed to exist somewhere outside of Damian's version of events. She'd never thought of it as protection. She'd just thought of it as being careful. She'd always been careful. She spent the afternoon in the storage space, going through files, pulling what she needed, setting aside anything that might be relevant to Gideon's team. It was detailed, painstaking work, the kind she'd done 100 times in conference rooms and hotel lobbies and the back seats of cars on the way to meetings. The kind that looked tedious from the outside and felt, when she was doing it well, like a very specific form of power. Around 4 o'clock, she sat on the floor, with her back against the storage unit's wall, and put both hands on her stomach and stayed like that for a while. She was tired. She was more tired than she'd admitted to Gideon or to herself. 5 months pregnant and awake since the small hours of the night before, running on the particular fuel of adrenaline that kicks in when the worst has already happened. And the only thing left is to figure out what you do next. Her back ached. Her feet were swollen inside her shoes. The baby moved. I know, she said out loud, to no one, or to him she'd started thinking of the baby as a him sometime in the last few weeks, without a confirmed reason, just an intuition. I know, we're figuring it out. She didn't cry. She'd told herself in the bathroom that morning that she would allow herself to cry later, in private, when there was no one watching and no decisions left to make that day. She hadn't cried yet. She was still in the figuring out phase, and crying would have felt like admitting that the figuring out might not be enough. She went back to the files. By 6 o'clock, she had 3 boxes of documents and a growing certainty that what she would find when Gideon's forensic accountant started pulling thread on Vale Meridian's books was going to be much larger than a personal betrayal. The bracelet had told her that. People who steal from people they love don't start with jewelry. They start with something bigger, and they work inward until the small things, the heirlooms, the trust, the 11 words on a text message at midnight, feel like just another transaction. She loaded the boxes into the car, and she drove back through the city as the lights came on all across Manhattan, and she thought about the charity gala that was coming in 3 weeks, where the Vale Meridian board and investors and half of New York's business press would be assembled in a ballroom to celebrate a company she had helped build with her own hands. She thought about that for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called Gideon. "How fast?" she said. "Can your forensic team move?" A pause. "Faster than most expect," he said. "Good," said Elara Quinn. "Because I think we're working with a deadline." The forensic accountants arrived on a Monday. Elara had spent the weekend doing what she'd always done when something was broken, and she didn't yet know how to fix it. She worked. She went through files. She made calls she needed to make. She ate when she remembered to eat, slept in 4-hour increments, and every time she woke in the dark and reached for the space beside her in the bed, she pulled her hand back before it got there, because she had decided on Saturday morning that she was not going to reach for that space anymore. Gideon had assembled a team of 3 forensic accountants from a firm out of Chicago, specifically out of Chicago, because none of them had any existing relationship with Vale Meridian or anyone connected to it. Their lead was a woman named Patricia Osize, small and precise, with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead like a second set of eyes she wasn't using yet. She shook Elara's hand in Gideon's conference room and didn't say anything warm or reassuring. She said, "Walk me through what access you currently have." Elara appreciated that. She was very tired of people deciding she needed to be handled carefully. She walked Patricia through everything: the tablet sync, the calendar entries, the cloud accounts that were still linked to devices Damian had replaced but not properly disconnected. It was a common mistake among people who thought about technology in terms of what it could do for them rather than what it could expose. Damian was extraordinary at the former and had always relied on other people to manage the latter. He'd relied on Elara specifically for years. She had managed it very thoroughly, which meant she had access to things he'd almost certainly forgotten she had access to. Patricia's team started pulling records within the hour. Elara sat in a side office with a cup of tea that went cold and read through the divorce proposal Damian's attorneys had sent, which she had still not formally rejected, because formally rejecting it would alert Harrison Briggs's office that she was preparing something larger, and she wasn't ready for Damian to know that yet. She read the confidentiality clause 3 times. It was broad, unusually broad. It prohibited her from making statements not just about the affair, but about Vale Meridian's business operations, its executive decisions, its financial arrangements, and its personnel. Personnel was an interesting word to put in a divorce settlement. She wrote a note to Gideon and slid it under the conference room door. The confidentiality clause covers Vale Meridian personnel. Why would that be necessary in a personal divorce filing? He opened the door 40 seconds later and looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "It wouldn't be," he said, "unless there were personnel they specifically needed you to stay quiet about." "Sabrina Cross," Elara said. "That's my read." She nodded. Went back to her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Patricia knocked on the side office door at 4:15 in the afternoon. She came in and closed the door behind her and sat down in the chair across from Elara, and she put a single printed page on the desk between them and said, "This is preliminary. We've had it 6 hours. But I wanted you to see this before we went further, because it changes the scope of what we're looking at." Elara looked at the page. It was a corporate structure diagram. At the top was Vale Meridian Group. Below it, connected by a series of thin lines like a family tree drawn by someone who didn't want to be understood, were a sequence of holding companies, most of them incorporated in jurisdictions she recognized from her years of contract work as places that existed specifically to make money hard to trace. The Caymans, Delaware shell entities. A trust registered in Liechtenstein that she'd seen in any corporate filing she'd been part of. At the bottom of the diagram, connected to 2 of those holding companies by lines that were labeled with dates from the past 18 months, was a name. Cross Meridian Holdings. She looked at it for a long time. Cross Meridian, she said. Incorporated 14 months ago, Patricia said. The registered agent is a law firm in Delaware that specializes in anonymized corporate structures. We haven't been able to confirm beneficial ownership yet. That'll take more time. But the name isn't a coincidence. No, said Patricia, probably not. Elara put the page back down on the desk and pressed her palms flat on either side of it, and breathed, just breathed. The baby shifted, and she thought, not now, we're working, which was a ridiculous thing to think at a child who had no concept of timing yet, and it almost made her laugh, which would have been the wrong reaction in this moment, and she knew it, so she pressed it down. How much money, she asked. Patricia hesitated, just briefly. It was the hesitation of a professional who understood that numbers, above a certain size, land differently on people than facts do. What we can trace so far, she said, across the 3 shell entities that feed into Cross Meridian, is approximately $43 million. Moved over an 18-month period. The room was very quiet. That's preliminary, Patricia added. There may be more we haven't reached yet. There's more, Elara said. Not a guess. A certainty, the kind that comes from having spent a decade watching the way a man's mind works, knowing the shape of his ambition, knowing that Damian Vale never did anything at 43 million when he could do it at 100. She stood up. Her back ached. She ignored it. Keep going, she said. I need the complete picture. Patricia picked up the page and nodded and went back to the conference room. And Elara walked to the window and looked out at the city and thought about the night Sabrina had driven over in her pajamas to hold her while she cried about a positive pregnancy test. $43 million. She trusts me more than anyone. She turned away from the window. Damian called at 7:15 that evening. She almost didn't answer. She had the phone in her hand, and she looked at his name on the screen, and she thought about what his voice would sound like, whether he'd be contrite or strategic, or somewhere in the nauseating middle, the practiced warmth of a man who'd been managing people's perceptions of him for 15 years. She answered because she needed to know which version she was dealing with. Elara, his voice was careful, not apologetic. Careful. Damian, I think we should talk. A pause. In person. I know it's a lot to ask right now. But there are things I want to explain to you that I can't put in a document. Your attorney already put things in a document. That was premature. Harrison moved faster than I asked him to. I'm sorry about that. She noticed he didn't say what else he was sorry about. She noticed the apology was specifically for the timing of the legal document, not for the contents of the gala photograph, or the 14 hotel addresses on his calendar, or the woman in his bed who'd been in Elara's kitchen 20 hours before she found out. Where are you? She asked. A beat. The Meridian Club, he said, the private members club Vale Meridian, maintained a permanent suite at 3 blocks from their building. She'd been there 100 times. She knew exactly what it looked like at 7. In the evening, the amber light, the leather chairs, the particular quiet of old money trying to sound relaxed. She knew that if she walked in there right now, she'd be on his territory, his lighting, his room. Tomorrow, she said. My attorney's office. 10 o'clock. The pause that followed was longer than it should have been for a man whose next line's going to be, of course. Elara, I don't think we need to make this into 10 o'clock, Damian. She hung up. Her hands weren't shaking this time. She noticed that. He didn't come at 10 o'clock. He sent Harrison Briggs instead, along with a revised settlement offer that was 30% higher than the first one and contained the same confidentiality clause with 3 additional pages attached to it. Harrison sat across from Gideon in the conference room and presented it with the smooth efficiency of someone who delivered bad news through good packaging. So many times it no longer registered as bad news to him at all. Elara sat at the end of the table and watched him. She was 5.5 months pregnant, and she hadn't slept more than 5 hours in 4 days, and her lower back felt like something was grinding in it. And she sat in that chair and watched Harrison Briggs lay out documents that were designed to buy her silence and make her disappear quietly from a company she had helped build from 11 employees in a burnt coffee office in Midtown. And she felt something clarify inside her, not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Something colder. Something that had been forming since the moment she'd read Sabrina's message on the tablet screen and understood, with total clarity, that she had been chosen specifically because she was trusting, because she was useful, because she could be managed. She was done being managed. "Mr. Briggs," she said when he was finished. "Miss Quinn," she said. "Elara Quinn." He blinked. "Miss Quinn. I understand this is a difficult— Does your client know," she said, "that his corporate accounts have been under forensic review since Monday?" The room went still. Gideon didn't move. Patricia, who was sitting in the corner with a laptop, didn't look up. Harrison Briggs's face did something complicated that he tried to smooth over immediately and didn't quite manage. I'm not asking you to confirm or deny anything," she said. "I'm asking you to go back to your client and tell him that the settlement window he's offering doesn't account for what we've already found. And what we've already found is enough." Harrison looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him with an expression that communicated, pleasantly but unmistakably, that he could look at him all day and it wouldn't change anything. "I'll relay your position," Harrison said. "Thank you," said Elara. "That's all." He left. Gideon waited until the elevator doors had closed and then said, "That's going to accelerate things." "I know. He'll tell Damian within the hour. Whatever they've been doing to protect the offshore structure, they'll start moving on it tonight." "Let them move," Elara said. "Patricia's team has already imaged everything. Whatever they delete, we still have." Gideon looked at her for a moment. Not the assessment look from their first meeting. Something else. "You're good at this," he said. "I know," she said again. Damian relied on that for 10 years. He just forgot to account for it. The text from Sabrina came at 2 in the morning. Elara was awake. She'd been unable to sleep, lying in the dark in the guest room she'd moved into because the main bedroom felt like a crime scene she hadn't finished processing, and her phone lit up on the nightstand with Sabrina's name, and she stared at it for a long time before she unlocked the screen. "I need you to know I didn't plan this. None of it was supposed to happen the way it did." Then, 30 seconds later, the bracelet. "I've been trying to find a way to explain that. I can't. I know there's no explanation." Then, a minute after that, "He told me you were already separating, that the marriage had been over for a year." I believed him. "I know that doesn't make it okay." Elara read all 3 messages. She put the phone face down on the nightstand. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything Sabrina had just said, and she sorted through it the way she sorted through contract language, looking for what was actually being communicated underneath the surface of the words. "I didn't plan this." A denial of premeditation, not a denial of participation. None of it was supposed to happen the way it did, which implied there was a version of this that was supposed to happen some other way, a version that had been thought about and planned for. "He told me you were already separating." An explanation, not an excuse, because Sabrina was smart enough to know it wouldn't read as an excuse, but a piece of information offered to reframe the timeline. I believed him. And there it was. Elara picked up the phone again. She typed one line. "Did you know I was pregnant when you got into his bed?" She sent it. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then nothing for 4 minutes. Then yes, 1 word. Elara looked at it. She put the phone back down. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She'd needed the confirmation. And now she had it, and it settled into the space between her ribs like something heavy and permanent that she would carry forward from this point and would never fully put down. Sabrina had known. She had known, and she had chosen, and she had driven over in her pajamas and held Elara while she cried and said, "You're going to be such an incredible mother," and she had known. Elara pressed her palm against her abdomen in the dark. "We're going to be fine," she said, out loud in the empty room. "I need you to know that. Whatever happens, in the next few weeks we're going to be fine." She meant it. That was the strange thing. She meant it completely, with more certainty than she'd felt about almost anything in months. Patricia's team found the second layer on Thursday. Cross Meridian Holdings was not, as they had initially mapped it, simply a financial vehicle for funneling money into assets for Sabrina. It was also connected, through a subsidiary registered in Nevada, to a consulting agreement with a company called Vantage Strategic Partners that had received payment from Vail Meridian over a period of 22 months for services that did not appear anywhere in Vail Meridian's official vendor records. Vantage Strategic Partners had 2 named officers. One was a man named Robert Cho, who appeared to be a legitimate, if small-scale management consultant with a practice in New Jersey. The other was Sabrina Cross. Elara sat with that document in her hands for a long time. Sabrina wasn't his mistress. He was his partner. She wasn't a woman who'd been swept up in an affair and made bad choices. She was a woman who had structured a financial arrangement, incorporated a company, signed documents, and received payments. She had done it while sitting at Elara's kitchen island, drinking coffee, and listening to Elara talk about her marriage and feeding information back to Damian. She had done it with full knowledge of what she was participating in. She had done it while helping Elara search for a bracelet she'd already taken. She had done it while knowing Elara was pregnant. Gideon came in and sat down across from her. "We need to talk about the gala," he said. "I know. It's in 11 days. The board, the investors, the press. Everyone who matters to Vale Meridian's institutional stability will be in one room." "I know," she said again. "If we bring this to the board before then, Damian has time to manage the narrative. He'll get ahead of it. Reach out individually to board members. Frame it as a domestic dispute with financial allegations that haven't been verified." Gideon paused. "If we bring it to the board at the gala, there's no private conversation," Elara said. "There's no spin. It happens in front of everyone, simultaneously, and whatever his response is, it happens in that room with cameras 30 feet away." Gideon nodded. "That's a significant escalation," he said. "Yes. He will not forgive it." She looked at him steadily. "He was never going to forgive me for finding out. I stopped worrying about what Damian was, or wasn't going to forgive the morning I called you." A pause. "I need to ask you something," Gideon said, "and I need you to answer honestly. All right, are you doing this for the money? For the legal outcome? Or is this personal?" She thought about it. Not because the answer wasn't clear, it was clear, but because she respected Gideon enough to give him a real answer rather than a fast one. "It's not personal," she said. "That's what makes it effective. If it were personal, I'd have driven to the Meridian Club Monday night and made a scene. Personal is loud and it burns itself out, and it gives people something to dismiss." She set the document down on the desk. "This is professional. The same way everything I did for Vale Meridian for 10 years was professional, because someone needed to be." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "We have 11 days. Sabrina called on Friday morning. Not a text this time. An actual call at 9:45 when Elara was in the car heading to Patricia's office to review the expanded financial map they'd assembled by the end of the week. She answered. "I know you don't want to hear from me," Sabrina said, and her voice was wrong tighter than usual, stripped of the ease that had always been one of her defining qualities. The sense she projected of someone who moved through the world without friction. "I know there's probably nothing I can say that." "Then why are you calling?" Elara said. Her voice came out flat, not unkind. Flat, a breath on the other end of the line. "He's not going to protect me," Sabrina said. "I think you should know that. Whatever he told his attorneys to offer you, it's not because he's trying to protect me. He's trying to protect himself. If this gets to the board," Sabrina, a pause. "If this gets to the board, he'll hand me over immediately. He'll frame the whole thing as something I initiated. The offshore accounts, the consulting arrangement, he'll say it was my idea. He'll say he didn't know." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. "I just wanted you to know that, because you deserve to know what kind of man you were married to." The irony of that sentence landed in the car like something thrown through a window. Elara breathed. "I know exactly what kind of man I was married to," she said. "I've known for 11 days. What I'm still figuring out is what kind of woman you are." Silence. "I think," Elara said, "that you're the kind of woman who calls her betrayed friend to warn her about the man they were both betrayed by, and you genuinely believe that makes you one of the good ones. Or at least less bad." She paused. "You're not less bad, Sabrina. You just have better instincts for self-preservation than he does." Another silence. Longer this time. "Gideon Rourke will be in touch with you soon," Elara said. "I'd recommend getting your own attorney before that happens." She hung up. The car moved through traffic. Outside, a woman was walking a very small dog past a coffee shop, and the dog stopped to smell a fire hydrant with absolute commitment, and the woman waited patiently, and somehow that small, ordinary moment, the patience of it, the complete normalcy of a dog smelling a fire hydrant on a Friday morning in Manhattan, made Elara's throat close for the first time in a week. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. held it. Let it go. Okay, she said quietly. She picked up her phone and texted Gideon one line. Sabrina knows what's coming. She'll try to make a deal. Make sure we control the timing. His reply came in 30 seconds. Already planned. We're on track. She saw Damian for the first time since the photograph, 10 days after she'd found it, at a routine meeting Gideon had arranged under the pretense of discussing the settlement timeline. He walked into the conference room, looking like he hadn't slept much either, which she noted without satisfaction. He was still handsome, still dressed with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was armor. He looked at her the way people look at something they've damaged, and are trying to assess how badly, calculating, careful, searching her face for information. She gave him none. She'd gotten good at that over the years, actually, working in rooms where everything depended on not showing your hand. Damian had always known she was good at it in other people's negotiations. He'd just never expected her to turn it on him. He sat down. You look tired, he said. I'm fine. Elara, Gideon has the document response. Talk to Harrison. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, the posture she associated with him when he was about to make a point he was particularly confident in. I know what you found on the tablet. I know how it looks. I need you to understand that Sabrina. I subpoenaed Cross Meridian Holdings this morning, she said, quietly, as a piece of information, not a weapon. Patricia's team finished the full account trace last night. We have 22 months of documented transfers. We have the Vantage Consulting agreement. We have Sabrina's signature on incorporation documents for a subsidiary that exists for no commercial purpose beyond receiving money from your accounts. She paused. We also have the emails. The ones on the old synchronized server. The ones your IT team forgot to scrub when you migrated platforms 2 years ago. The color in his face changed. Not dramatically. Enough. What emails, he said. His voice was careful now. Very careful. The ones where you asked her whether I suspected anything, Elara said. And she told you I trusted her more than anyone. The conference room was absolutely quiet. Damian looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd looked at a photograph under a chandelier, and watched her world stop. She saw it on his face, not guilt, not remorse, but something rawer and more honest than either of those. The specific expression of a man who has just realized, fully and finally, that the person sitting across from him is not the person he thought she was. That he had spent 10 years standing next to a woman and never once understood what she was capable of. She held his gaze. The gala is in 8 days, she said. She stood up. She picked up her bag. I'll see you there, she said, and she walked out of the room and did not look back, and the elevator doors closed behind her, and she put her hand flat against the cool metal wall of the elevator and breathed out very slowly because she was 5.5 months pregnant, and she'd just 5.5 months pregnant, and she'd just set something in motion that could not be stopped now, and she needed 8 more days, and she was going to get them, and she was not going to fall apart before she did. The elevator opened. She walked out into the lobby, into the noise and light of the city, and she kept walking. 8 days felt like a long time, until it didn't. Elara had learned something about time in the past 2 weeks, that it moved differently when you were holding something heavy. The days didn't pass so much as they accumulated, each one adding weight to the next, and by the time you reached the end of the week you weren't counting forward anymore. You were counting the distance you'd already carried. 7 days out from the gala, Patricia's team delivered the complete financial map. It covered an entire conference table. Elara stood at one end of it, and Patricia stood at the other, and neither of them said anything for almost a full minute, because there are documents you read, and there are documents you absorb, and this one required absorbing. It was 41 pages. It documented, across a 22-month period, the systematic movement of what Patricia now estimated to be between $80 and $90 million through a network of 7 shell entities, 3 offshore accounts, 2 consulting agreements, and a series of real estate transactions that had been structured to look like ordinary corporate investment, but were, when you trace the beneficial ownership chains to their ends, personal enrichment dressed in a corporate costume, $80 to $90 million. There's something else, Patricia said. She said it, the way she said everything evenly, without inflection, the way a surgeon announces a complication. We found a third party. Elara looked up from the map. Someone outside Vale Meridian. Outside Cross Meridian Holdings. a separate entity that received payment from 2 of the offshore accounts during the same period. Patricia moved around the table and pointed to a cluster of lines on the far left of the document. The entity is called Northgate Capital Advisory. It's registered in the Channel Islands. The beneficial owner is, as far as we can currently determine, a man named Gerald Prentice. The name meant nothing to Elara immediately. Then it did. Gerald Prentice, she said. He's on the audit committee. Vale Meridian's board. Yes, the room was very quiet. He's been receiving payments, Elara said, for 20 months, structured to fall under the threshold that would trigger mandatory disclosure, just under, each time. It's deliberate. Elara pulled out the chair nearest to her and sat down. Not because she needed to, because the implications of what Patricia had just told her required her to stop moving for a moment and think clearly. And she thought better when she was still. Gerald Prentice was not a passive board member. He was the chair of the audit committee. He was the man whose job it was, whose legal and fiduciary obligation it was to catch exactly the kind of financial manipulation Patricia's team had just spent 10 days documenting. He was the first person the board would have turned to if anyone had raised concerns about Vale Meridian's accounts, and he had been receiving payments from the same offshore network the whole time. Can we prove beneficial ownership? Elara asked. Not yet. The Channel Island structure is designed to require a court order for full disclosure. What we have is the payment trail in and the entity name. Patricia paused. It would hold up to scrutiny. It doesn't prove intent yet. It doesn't need to prove intent yet, Elara said slowly. It needs to make the board unable to ignore it. It needs to make any board member who sees this document ask the question loud enough that Prentice can't answer it quietly. Patricia nodded. Elara looked at the map again. At the 41 pages of lines and entities and numbers and dates that represented everything Damian and Sabrina had been doing while she ate soup alone on Friday nights. Gerald Prentice changed things. Not the plan stayed, but the risk profile of the plan changed significantly because she'd been working on the assumptions that the board, once presented with the financial evidence, would act without hesitation. Clean, institutional outrage. The kind that happened when a CEO stole from shareholders and there was no ambiguity about it. But if the chair of the audit committee was implicated, the board's first reaction might not be outrage. It might be fear. Fear of what disclosure meant for their own liability. Fear of the institutional fallout. Fear of the question that inevitably followed the discovery that the person who was supposed to catch the problem had been paid to look away. Some of them would want to make it disappear. She needed to make sure disappearing wasn't an option. I need to talk to Gideon, she said. Tonight. Gideon lived in a brownstone in the West Village that looked exactly like the home of a man who had spent 40 years winning difficult cases and didn't feel any particular need to announce it. He answered the door himself, which she appreciated. She came in and sat down at his kitchen table without ceremony, because it was 10 o'clock in the evening, and she was 23 weeks pregnant, and her back hurt, and there was no time left for ceremony. She put the Northgate Capital Advisory documentation on the table between them. He read it without speaking, all the way through. She watched him, read the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth when he got to the Prentice connection. The stillness that came over him afterward that she'd learned to recognize as him recalculating. He put the papers down. Prentice, he said, yes. If Prentice is compromised, the board's first instinct will be defensive. I know. We lose the element of unified institutional response. Some of them will want to convene privately first. Control the disclosure. Manage the optics. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. Which is why we can't give them the option. The gala isn't just the venue anymore. It's the mechanism. Every board member, every institutional investor, every journalist who covers this company, they all need to be in the room simultaneously. Not briefed privately the next morning. In the room. Because the moment this breaks in private, Prentice makes calls and the narrative gets managed before anyone outside Vale Meridian has a chance to hear the unmanaged version. Gideon was quiet for a moment. We need to give the financial evidence to the board before the gala begins, he said. Not during. Before, so they've seen it. They're already reacting. And when Damian walks in, he's walking into a room that already knows. Can you deliver it without Prentice intercepting? I can deliver it to 4 specific board members who are not Prentice and not connected to any of the offshore entities. Directors who have been on this board long enough to be angry about what this does to their legacy if it comes out wrong. He paused. Margaret Holloway, Tom Chen. Farida Oates, she's Patricia's cousin, Elara said. She is. That's not a conflict. That's a character reference. He picked up the papers. I'll need 48 hours to prep the package. You have 6 days, I know. He stood. Put the kettle on. The small, mundane domesticity of it, a man in his kitchen putting a kettle on at 10 o'clock because his client was pregnant and had been awake since 6 and needed something warm, almost undid her. She looked away from it. There's a second problem, she said. He turned. Damian knows I found the emails. I told him in the meeting yesterday. She kept her voice level. He now knows I have more than the affair and the basic offshore structure. He knows I have the communications. He's going to move. To do what? I don't know yet. Something. He's not a passive man, Gideon. He didn't build a billion-dollar company by sitting still when someone came at him. She paused. I need someone watching the offshore accounts for movement. If he starts liquidating, we need to know immediately. Patricia's team is already flagged for that. And I need to know if he contacts Prentice. A pause. That's harder to monitor legally. I'm not asking you to monitor it illegally. I'm asking you to watch for indirect signals. If Prentice makes any unusual moves in the next 6 days, calls an emergency audit committee session, tries to contact other board members privately, initiates any kind of internal review, that's your signal. Gideon looked at her. You've thought about this for a while, he said. I've had trouble sleeping, she said. It turns out that's useful. He put a mug of tea on the table in front of her. Go home, he said. Get as much rest as you can. The next 6 days are going to be long. She wrapped both hands around the mug. Gideon, she said, is there any scenario where this doesn't work? He didn't answer immediately. She respected that. There's always a scenario, he said finally. The offshore ownership chain breaks before we can get a court to pierce it. Prentice gets enough board members to convene a private session before the gala and the institutional response fractures. Damian's attorneys file an emergency injunction against the document delivery on grounds of misappropriation. He sat back down. Any of those happens, we lose the simultaneity. We lose the controlled disclosure. And then it becomes a fight we can still win, but on a longer timeline. I need it to happen at the gala, she said. I need it to be finished. I can't carry this past that room. She hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out before she could edit it, raw and unguarded, in a way she'd been careful not to be since the morning she'd called him. She felt her jaw tighten. Gideon looked at her with the expression she'd decided she didn't mind from him. Not pity, not discomfort, just a straightforward acknowledgement that she was a person and not just a client. Then we make it happen at the gala, he said. 3 days before the gala, Damian made his move. She found out at 7 in the morning from a text from Gideon that said only, "Call me now." She called him from the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed in the gray early light, still in the oversized shirt she'd slept in, and he told her that at 11 o'clock the previous night, Harrison Briggs had filed an emergency motion in New York Supreme Court, seeking a temporary restraining order on the grounds that Elara had unlawfully accessed Vale Meridian's proprietary corporate systems, using stored credentials she had no current authorization to use, and that all documents, financial records, and communications obtained through that access were therefore inadmissible and subject to immediate return. She sat with that for a moment. The tablet, she said. The tablet. The cloud sync. The server access. All of it. Gideon's voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort in it. He's arguing that your access to those systems ended when you stopped functioning in an official capacity at Vale Meridian, which his attorneys are dating to 4 years ago. They're saying everything you pulled is fruit of an unauthorized intrusion. I had his password, she said. He gave it to me 3 years ago for a specific purpose. His argument is that authorization doesn't carry forward indefinitely. She stopped, breathed. How strong is the motion? Stronger than I'd like, Gideon said. The judge assigned to it is Whitmore. He's conservative on property rights, including intellectual property and proprietary data. If he grants the TRO, we lose the ability to use anything we pulled from the cloud accounts in any proceeding. That includes the emails, the calendar entries, the synchronized messages from the old device. She stood up. She needed to pace. The room was small for pacing, but she did it anyway, back and forth between the window and the door. The forensic accounting, she said. Patricia's team pulled the account records through Vale Meridian's internal systems. Same problem? Potentially. The motion covers all access through stored credentials. What about the documents I pulled myself? Physical files from the storage unit. The contracts I negotiated. It's correspondence where I'm a named party. Those are yours. Unambiguously. But they establish your contributions to the company, not the financial misconduct. Without the account records, we can prove you were invisible and undercredited. We can't prove fraud. The room felt smaller than it was. She stopped pacing. When is the hearing? Tomorrow afternoon. 2:00. The gala is in 3 days. She pressed her free hand flat against the wall. Cold plaster. She focused on that, the specific temperature and texture of it. A thing that was solid and real. What do we argue? She said. Implied authorization through course of conduct. You use those credentials routinely over a period of years, with Damian's knowledge and consent. You access them in the context of managing his affairs, which you demonstrably did in an ongoing capacity. The authorization was never formally revoked. He paused. It's a credible argument. It's not a certain one. What's our probability? A silence. 60-40, he said. In our favor, maybe. She laughed. Came out short and hard and not particularly amused. He's smart, she said. Not admiringly. Just factually. The way you acknowledge a quality in an opponent that you need to account for. He knew I'd access the accounts. He let me find things, Gideon. He let the process get this far, and then he pulls the rug at 72 hours out. He may have been waiting to see how much we had before deciding whether the TRO was worth the publicity. He decided we have enough to be worth the publicity. She stopped moving, stood still in the middle of the small room. He's not trying to win the divorce. He's trying to win the criminal exposure. If the financial evidence gets suppressed, the board never sees it. The gala happens. He stands in that room like nothing is wrong, and whatever he's been building with Prentice is enough to weather the rest. That's his play, Gideon confirmed. She thought about what Gerald Prentice's face would look like in that ballroom if Damian walked in with nothing over his head. She thought about what Sabrina's face would look like. She thought about the 41-page map spread across Patricia's conference table, and all the lines connecting all the entities, and the $80 to $90 million that had moved through them while she was being careful and trusting and building a life she'd thought was real. Is there anything outside the cloud, Seth? She said. Anything we have that doesn't touch the TRO? Gideon was quiet for a moment. The real estate transactions, he said slowly. 2 of the properties connected to Cross Meridian Holdings were recorded in public county records. Those are public documents. We didn't pull them through any proprietary system. What do they show? They show Sabrina Cross as beneficial owner of 2 properties with purchase prices as inconsistent with any known income she's had. They show the purchases occurred during the same period as the offshore transfers. They don't explicitly show the connection to Vale Meridian funds. That connection runs through the account records, but they show the anomaly. And the Vantage Consulting Agreement? Sabrina's incorporation documents for Vantage Strategic Partners are public record. Delaware public record. Her name is on them. The company's existence is provable without touching the cloud access. So we have her, Elara said. We can't prove exactly where the money came from without the account records. But we can prove she built a financial structure that received money, that the money was inconsistent with legitimate income, and that she incorporated a consulting company with Vale Meridian connections, while being the CEO's undisclosed intimate partner. It's circumstantial without the account records. It's enough to ask the question out loud, she said, in a room full of investors, in front of journalists. She paused. And if Sabrina is in that room when the question gets asked mine, she won't hold, Gideon said quietly. She called you. She's already looking for an exit. Then we give her one, Elara said, before the gala. We give her an exit that requires her to cooperate, to conform, on record, what the account records would have shown. That's a negotiation with her attorney. Start it tonight. A pause. Elara. His voice was careful. If the TRO is granted tomorrow, and Sabrina doesn't cooperate in time, you're walking into that gala with circumstantial evidence and no smoking gun. I know. That's a significant risk. I know that too, she went to the window. Outside, the city was already moving the ordinary, relentless machinery of it, indifferent to everything happening in this small room on the 14th floor. But Damian filed that motion because he's afraid. People who are winning don't file emergency motions 72 hours before the event they're afraid of. They wait. They let the event pass. They manage it afterward. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass. He's afraid because he knows what I'm capable of. He just doesn't know which version of it I'm using. She turned away from the window. I'll be at the hearing tomorrow, she said. I want to see his face when Whitmore makes the ruling. The courtroom was the kind of room that had seen everything. Judge Whitmore, 63, with a face like weathered oak, and the manner of a man who had given up performing patience sometime in his late 40s and was now just genuinely patient. He listened to Harrison Briggs's argument for 40 minutes. He listened to Gideon for 35. He asked both sides 4 questions that cut with the precision of someone who had already identified exactly where the case turned before anyone had finished talking. Elara sat in the gallery and watched Damian. He sat at the plaintiff's table in a dark suit and didn't look at her once. That was deliberate. She knew it was deliberate. Because the Damian she'd married would have looked at her by now, would have made some attempt at the kind of eye contact that communicated either contrition or confidence, depending on what he was trying to project. The fact that he was keeping his gaze forward, fixed on the bench, meant someone had told him not to engage with her. Harrison Briggs, probably. It was good courtroom advice. It also meant he was more nervous than he was showing. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. She'd spent 10 years watching those shoulders in boardrooms and across dinner tables and in the early mornings before he was fully awake. And she knew what his controlled posture looked like versus what it looked like when he was maintaining it deliberately. The difference was small. The muscles at the base of his neck were working. He was afraid. She held that knowledge quietly and didn't move. Whitmore took a 15-minute recess and came back and gave his ruling in 8 sentences. The first 4 were about the legal standard for implied authorization under New York commercial law. The next 2 were about course of conduct and the established practice of shared credential use in a marital business context. The 7th sentence noted that the motion as filed was insufficiently specific to establish a clear boundary of authorized versus unauthorized access. The 8th sentence denied the TRO. Harrison Briggs sat back in his chair in a way that was almost imperceptible and would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Damian's shoulders changed, just slightly. The controlled tension shifted into something else. Not defeat, not yet, but the specific recalibration of a man who has just had his fallback position removed and is now calculating what comes next with time than he expected. Gideon gathered his papers without expression. Elara stood, picked up her bag, and walked out of the courtroom. She took the elevator to the lobby and pushed through the heavy doors into the afternoon and stood on the courthouse steps in the October cold and breathed. In and out. Slow. The kind of breathing she'd been doing since the baby started making it complicated to breathe normally, deliberate, conscious, a choice rather than a reflex. Her phone rang. Patricia. We finished the Sabrina negotiation, Patricia said. Her voice was neutral in the way it got when she was delivering information that was both good and complicated. Her attorney called Gideon's office during the hearing. She'll sign a cooperation agreement. Full confirmation of the offshore structure, her role in Vantage, the consulting arrangement, the asset purchases, everything. In exchange for what? Immunity from civil suit by Vale Meridian's shareholders. Criminal exposure is still on the table. We can't promise her anything there. But the civil's liability is substantial, and her attorney convinced her that cooperation was her only viable path. Elara stood on the courthouse steps and looked out at the street. She's going to testify against Damian, she said. In writing, by declaration before the gala. Her attorney wants it finalized by tomorrow evening. Tell Gideon to make sure the declaration covers Prentice. If she has anything on his involvement, we need it in that document. A pause. She has something, Patricia said. Her attorney mentioned it. She witnessed a conversation. She's willing to describe it. The cold air moved through the city, and Elara stood in it and felt something that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't relief, but was in the territory between them, the specific sensation of watching a structure you've been building for. 3 weeks hold its own weight for the first time. Good, she said. She hung up. She stood there for another moment. Then she put her hand on her abdomen, the way she always did now when she needed to locate herself, and she thought about the gala in 2 days. The burgundy velvet dress she'd ordered last week, not as armor, she told herself, though it functioned as armor that Gideon's assistant had picked up from the alteration shop that morning. The shoes she could still manage, barely. The staircase at the Meridian Grand that she'd walked down 100 times and would walk down one more time from the top with Gideon beside her, into a ballroom full of people who thought they already knew the story of Vale Meridian. She thought about Damian standing somewhere behind her right now, in that courthouse, recalibrating. She thought about Sabrina signing a declaration that would dismantle in 10 pages what they'd built together in 18 months. She thought about Gerald Prentice, who didn't know yet that Sabrina had seen something she was now willing to describe in a signed legal document. The city moved around her, indifferent and relentless, and she was still standing. She was 23 weeks pregnant, and she had not slept more than 5 hours in any single night for the past 3 weeks. And she was still standing on these courthouse steps. And in 48 hours, it would either be over or it would become something else entirely. And she could not control which one it was going to be. And that was the one thing she had never been fully able to make peace with. She had always been the one who could manage outcomes, who could read the room, redirect the conversation by the time. The one who caught the deal when it was falling and closed it before anyone else realized it had been in danger. But you could not manage a ballroom full of people once the first domino fell. You could only choose which domino to push. She walked down the courthouse steps to the car, and the driver held the door, and she got in, and she told him to take her home, not the penthouse, not the storage unit, not Gideon's office home, where she would eat something real and take a bath and sleep as many hours as her body would allow, because in 48 hours she was going to walk into a room and push the first domino. And everything after that would happen without her permission, and she needed to be ready for it in a way that had nothing to do with documents or strategy, and everything to do with being. Simply, the kind of person who could stand inside the chaos she'd created and not break. She'd always been that person. She just hadn't known it until the night she picked up a forgotten tablet to turn off a lamp, and her world stopped. And she'd had to decide, in that first terrible silent minute, what kind of woman she was going to be on the other side of it. The car pulled into traffic. 48 hours. She closed her eyes, and for once, she let herself rest. She slept 6 hours. Not well the kind of sleep that happens in layers, where part of you is under, and part of you is still running calculations in the dark. But 6 hours was more than she'd managed in 3 weeks, and she woke to the alarm at 6 in the morning, feeling something she hadn't felt in long enough that she had to identify it deliberately. Ready. Not calm, not confident. Ready, the specific state of a person who has done everything that could be done in the available time and has arrived at the moment where doing it is finished and only being remains. She lay in the gray early light for exactly 2 minutes. She counted them. Then she got up. Gideon called at 7:15. Sabrina's declaration came in at midnight, he said. Her attorney pushed to finalize before she changed her mind. I've read it twice. And it's complete. She confirms the offshore structure, her role in Vantage, the asset purchases. She confirms that Damian told her the financial arrangement was structured specifically to avoid triggering internal audit review. A pause. And she describes the conversation with Prentice. Elara was standing in the kitchen with a glass of water, and she put it down on the counter carefully. What conversation? 8 months ago. A dinner private at a restaurant in the West Village. Damian, Prentice, and Sabrina. Sabrina wasn't supposed to be there. Damian brought her at the last minute. She says Prentice knew about the offshore structure. He didn't know the full amount, according to her account, but he knew money was being moved outside normal channels, and he agreed to ensure the audit committee's quarterly review would not flag it. He agreed, Elara said. He said, and I'm reading from her declaration, as long as the numbers that reach my desk are the right numbers, I don't need to know where the other numbers went. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a garbage truck was moving down the street, its mechanical grinding loud and ordinary, and completely indifferent to the fact that a woman was standing barefoot on a cold tile floor, processing the information that the person whose job was to protect Vale Meridian shareholders from exactly This kind of theft had accepted a quiet arrangement to look the other way. That's enough, Elara said. That's enough to bring to the board tonight. Combined with the public records on Cross Meridian Holdings and the Vantage Incorporation documents. Yes, we don't need the cloud account records. The declaration carries it. Gideon paused. There's one more thing, she waited. Damian knows about the declaration. Sabrina's attorney notified Harrison Briggs as a courtesy standard practice when a cooperation agreement involves a correspondent. Harrison called my office 40 minutes ago. What did he say? He said his client would like a final conversation with you. Before tonight, he said Damian wants to speak to you directly, without attorneys, and that what he has to say is his word significant. She looked out the kitchen window at the street below. The garbage truck had moved on. The street was quiet now, the ordinary morning quiet of a city that hadn't started its day yet in earnest. No attorneys, she said. That's what he asked for. Where? He suggested the penthouse. On the grounds that it's your home as much as his. It stopped being my home 25 days ago. She picked up her water glass again. Tell Harrison I'll meet him at the Meridian Club at 9. Neutral ground. 1 hour. Elara, I'm not comfortable with you. I'm not asking for your comfort, Gideon. I'm asking you to relay the message. She softened it slightly because he'd earned that. I'll call you after. Before I get dressed. A pause. 1 hour, he said. If you don't call me by 10:15, I'm sending someone. That won't be necessary. Humor me. Fine. The Meridian Club at 9 in the morning had a specific quality of silence, the silence of a place that existed for people who needed to have conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else, insulated by money and mahogany, and the understanding that what was said inside its walls stayed there. She'd been here with Damian dozens of times. She knew the staff by name. 3 of them greeted her on the way in, each with a careful neutrality that told her. They'd been briefed that the situation was complicated. She rode the elevator to the 4th floor. He was already there, in the corner suite, standing at the window with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which meant he'd been there long enough to get restless. A bottle of water sat unopened on the table between 2 chairs. He'd prepared the room for a conversation. He'd thought about where to sit. She sat in the chair nearest the door. He turned when she came in. He looked bad. Not dramatically bad. Damian Vale was not the kind of man who wore his deterioration visibly enough to invite sympathy. But there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, a tightness around his jaw that came from days of grinding the kind of tension you couldn't put down, even when you slept. She recognized it because she'd been carrying it herself. He sat down across from her. He didn't speak immediately, which was unusual. Damian had always been a man who owned the opening of a room. She waited. I made a mistake, he said finally. She looked at him. I know that doesn't. He stopped. Started again. I know what you found. I know what Sabrina signed. I know what's in the declaration. His hands were flat on his thighs, a posture she associated with him when he was trying to be deliberate rather than reactive. I'm not here to negotiate. Harrison can handle that. I'm here because he exhaled, looked at the table. Because I wanted to tell you myself that I'm sorry. Not through an attorney. Not in a document. To your face. She kept her expression neutral. You knew, she said. About the declaration. Yes. And your first call was to ask for this meeting. Yes. Why? He looked at her then. Really looked at her. The way he used to in the early years when they were still learning each other's edges. Because tonight is going to be what it is, he said. And after tonight, I won't have access to you. You're going to make sure of that. You've been making sure of that for 3 weeks. He paused. I just needed you to know that I know what I had. I don't think I knew it clearly enough until I was standing in a courthouse hallway, watching you walk out of a hearing you won. She was quiet for a moment. Damian, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Not because it changes anything for tonight, because I've been carrying the question for 3 weeks and I'd like to put it down. He nodded. Did you ever tell Sabrina that the marriage was already over? That we were already separated? Something moved across his face. It wasn't surprise he'd known the question was coming, or something like it. It was something older than surprise, closer to shame, though Damian was not a man who wore shame easily, and it fit him the way clothes fit people who aren't used to wearing them. Yes, he said, to justify it to her. Yes, but it wasn't true. No, he said quietly, it wasn't true. She nodded once. Then you gave her a permission she didn't have the right to use, Elara said. And she chose to use it anyway, and together you built something that cost more than either of you was willing to count. She stood up, picked up her bag. I believe you're sorry. I think you mean it right now. In this room, at this specific moment. I think you're capable of meaning it. She looked at him. I don't think that's enough. I stopped thinking it was enough about 22 days ago. She walked to the door. Elara. She stopped. Didn't turn. The baby, he said. His voice was different. Stripped of the careful management he'd been applying to every word since she sat down. I want to be his father. Whatever happens tonight. Whatever happens after. I want you to know that. She stood at the door with her hand on the frame. Then be one, she said. That's a choice you make after tonight. Not something you negotiate in this room. She left. She was back in the apartment by 10. She called Gideon from the bathroom while she drew a bath, because standing was starting to cost her more than she wanted to admit, and she needed to be on her feet for several more hours tonight, and she was going to spend every available minute between now and 7 p.m. horizontal or submerged in warm water. How was it? He asked. Finished, she said. He's not going to do anything between now and tonight. He said what he needed to say. He knows what's coming. He might still try to contact the board members individually. He might. But he won't reach Holloway or Chen or Farida without going through their offices, and by the time anyone calls back, they'll already have your package. She lowered herself into the water. Exhaled, Gideon. The board packaged, it's delivered, 40 minutes ago. Hand-delivered to each of the 4 directors by separate messengers. Signed confirmation of receipt from all 4. A pause. Margaret Holloway called my office immediately after opening hers. What did she say, she said, and I'm quoting. Tell your client we'll be ready. Elara closed her eyes. Good, she said. I'll be there at 7. The dress fit differently than it had at the fitting. She stood in front of the mirror at 6:15 and looked at herself in the burgundy velvet and thought about the woman who had stood in front of mirrors in this apartment getting dressed for 20 company events. Before this one, always slightly in the background of how she thought about herself. Always the person who made sure things ran smoothly and was there when it mattered, but didn't take the room when she walked in. She took the room tonight. The dress was designed for exactly that, the particular kind of presence that comes not from loudness but from clarity. The color was a deep, arterial red that she'd chosen deliberately, and the cut accommodated her pregnancy, without concealing it, the fabric moving with the weight and shape of her body rather than around it. Her hair was up. She wore no jewelry, except the small diamond earrings her mother had given her at graduation, not the bracelet. The bracelet was in a box. The bracelet was evidence. She looked at herself for a long moment. The woman in the mirror was 23 weeks pregnant and had not slept properly in a month and had approximately 3 hours of sustained energy left in her body before the physical cost of the past 3 weeks would start collecting its debt in ways she couldn't manage through will alone. 3 hours was exactly what she needed. She picked up her phone and called Patricia. We're set, Patricia said before Elara could speak. The document package is with Gideon. The directors have confirmed receipt. Sabrina's declaration has been authenticated and filed. A pause. And we have something else. Tell me. Prentice contacted 2 of the offshore account administrators this afternoon. He was trying to initiate a transfer, move funds before the gala. Patricia's voice was very even. He used his personal authorization codes. The administrator flagged it because the request deviated from the established protocol, apparently. Damian's codes were required in conjunction with Prentice's for any transfer above a certain threshold, and Prentice was trying to execute unilaterally. He panicked, Elara said. The transfer didn't go through, but the attempt is documented. The administrator preserved the request as part of their own compliance protocol, and we have a copy. How? The administrator is incorporated in Switzerland. Their domestic compliance law requires them to preserve and, in certain circumstances attempts, disclose anomalous transaction attempts. They disclosed it to Patricia's correspondent there this afternoon. That connects Prentice directly, Elara said. His personal codes, attempting to move money out of an account connected to the offshore network. Yes. She sat down on the edge of the bed. The burgundy velvet pooled around her. She was very still for a moment. Gerald Prentice, the chair of the audit committee, had tried to move money this afternoon, on the day of the gala, which meant he knew what was coming tonight, And he had chosen, at the last possible moment, not to run, but to grab. The audacity of it almost took her breath away. "Send everything to Gideon," she said. "Right now. He needs it before we walk in. Already done." She stood up. "Patricia," she said. "Thank you." A brief pause. Patricia was not a woman who received gratitude with ease. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Go finish it." The car arrived at 6:55. Gideon was waiting outside the Meridian Grand in a dark suit, his silver hair precisely in order. His expression, the face of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and understood that composure in the final moments before a significant action was not a performance, but a professional obligation. He looked at her when she stepped out of the car, and something in his face shifted, not surprise, but a kind of recognition. The recognition of someone seeing another person fully for the first time. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." "The directors are inside." They arrived early. Holloway corralled the others into a pre-event meeting on the pretext of a routine governance item. "They're in the mezzanine conference room with the complete document package." He fell into step beside her as they moved toward the entrance. "Damian arrived 12 minutes ago. Sabrina is with him." "Of course she is. She's cooperated fully. She signed the declaration. But she came tonight." He said it carefully, like a fact that might require processing. "I know," Elara said. "She's still hoping there's a version of this where she's standing when it's over." "Is there?" "Not in that ballroom." The doors of the Meridian Grand opened. The ballroom was at full capacity, 400 people moving through the amber light and white tablecloths and the specific, elegant noise of a crowd that believed itself to be attending a celebration. She recognized faces everywhere. Board members, institutional investors, executives from Vail Meridian's partner companies, journalists from 3 major financial publications who covered the technology sector and had written, collectively, thousands of words about Damian Vail's genius and his vision and the remarkable machine he'd built. They were about to write different words. She felt Gideon's hand at her elbow, not steering, just present, as they crossed the lobby to the base of the grand staircase, and she looked up at the top of it, and she thought about what it meant to walk down a staircase in a room full of people who expected you to be invisible. 2 minutes, Gideon said quietly. "The directors will move from the mezzanine to flank the main floor in 2 minutes. When you reach the bottom step, we serve." She nodded. "You're going to feel a lot of things in the next 20 minutes, he said. "Not advice. Just acknowledgement. Don't let any of them move faster than you do." "I never have," she said. She put her hand on the banister, and she started walking down. She heard it before she felt it, the particular quality of a room's changing. The way 400 people don't go silent all at once, but rather the silence moves through them in a wave, starting from the people nearest the staircase and rippling outward as they turned and saw her. She kept her pace steady. Not slow would read as performance. Steady. The pace of a woman who was exactly where she intended to be, moving at exactly the speed she'd chosen. She was halfway down when she saw Damian. He was near the center of the room, standing with a cluster of investors she recognized from the most recent shareholder meeting, and he turned with them when the crowd shifted, and when he saw her, his face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession shock. Something that might have been, in another life, a kind of terrible pride, and then the controlled blankness of a man who understood that the next few minutes were going to define the rest of his life, and was trying to decide how to stand inside that. Sabrina was 2 steps to his left. She saw Elara and went very still, not the stillness of composure. The stillness of an animal that has heard something and hasn't decided yet whether to run. Elara reached the bottom step. Gideon was at her side, and from 3 different positions on the main floor, the board members moved. Margaret Holloway came from the left, 71 years old, 22 years, on the Vail Meridian board, 4 feet 11 and built like someone who had outlasted everyone who'd ever underestimated her. Tom Chen and Farida Ose came from the right. They converged toward Damian with the quiet purpose of people who had already made a decision and were now implementing it. Gideon stepped forward. The room had gone nearly silent now. Not completely, there were still pockets of conversation at the outer edges, people who hadn't yet registered what was happening. But the center of the room was silent, and the center was where it mattered. Harrison Briggs appeared from somewhere near the bar, moving fast, and Elara watched him assess the situation. In 3 seconds, the 4 board members converging. Gideon standing with a document folder, the specific quality of the silence, and watched his face understand that he was too late. Gideon handed Damian the divorce papers. He did it cleanly, without speech, a simple transfer of paper from one hand to another, and Damian took them reflexively, because when someone hands you something, your hands respond before your brain does. And then he looked down at what he was holding, and his jaw tightened, and the room watched him hold the legal end of his marriage in his hands under 400 watts of chandelier light. Then Gideon turned to Sabrina. The subpoena was smaller than the divorce papers, a single folded document, standard issue, utterly unremarkable in appearance and absolutely devastating in content. He handed it to her the same way, cleanly, without drama, a simple delivery. Sabrina took it. She looked at it. She looked at Elara, and Elara looked back at her, and she held Sabrina's gaze for the first time since the photograph under the chandelier. And she let her see not anger, not triumph, not the grief that was still living somewhere in the space between her ribs where trust used to be. Just clarity. The clear, complete, unambiguous face of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had chosen to do it. Sabrina looked away first. Damian's voice came out rough, scraped thin. You knew she was pregnant. Not a question. He was looking at Sabrina. The room was silent enough that people 6 tables away could hear it. Sabrina didn't answer. She couldn't. Her attorney had specifically told her to say nothing in any public forum, and for once in the past 18 months, she was listening. But Elara could answer. She knew before you did, Elara said. She said it clearly, not loudly. The way she'd always made her most significant points in a register, that required the room to be quiet to hear, and was quiet so they heard it. Damian closed his eyes. Just for a second. Just briefly. The way people do when something lands in a place they weren't braced for. When he opened them, Margaret Holloway was at his elbow. Damian, she said. Her voice had the texture of someone who had been fond of him once, and was mourning that fondness at the same time she was ending it. We need to go upstairs. The full board is waiting. He looked at Holloway. He looked at Elara. She watched him make a calculation, the last calculation of a man who had built something real and then stolen from it, and was now standing in the ruins of both the thing he'd built and the theft, with no version of events that led anywhere other than the room upstairs, where the board was waiting. He went. Holloway walked beside him. Chen and Farida followed. They moved through the ballroom with the terrible, quiet efficiency of people conducting the final act of something institutional and permanent, and the crowd parted for them the way crowds part when they understand, instinctively, that they are witnessing something that will be written about. Elara stood at the bottom of the staircase. Her back was screaming, had been screaming for the last 10 minutes. The particular grinding ache that had been building for 3 weeks and had reached tonight a level she was managing through the specific mechanism of not allowing herself to acknowledge it until she had privacy to do so. She breathed. Gideon was beside her. Prentice, she said quietly. Chen has the transfer attempt documentation. He'll present it when the board convenes. Gerald's in the room? He was. He's going to walk into that meeting not knowing we have the Swiss correspondence. Gideon's voice was very even. He's going to sit down across from 4 board members who have spent the last 2 hours reading about his arrangement with Damian, and then Tom Chen is going to put the transfer attempt on the table. And he'll fold, Elara said. Yes. Around them, the ballroom was beginning to reconstitute itself, conversations restarting. People moving again, the noise building back toward something approaching normal, though the normal had fundamentally changed, because there were things people knew, now that they hadn't known 40 minutes ago. Journalists were already on their phones. She could see it from where she stood, the particular way a journalist holds a phone when they're talking to an editor. She felt the first wave of it then. Not triumph, not relief. Something heavier and older than either of those, the exhaustion of someone who has been holding something at arm's length for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. It moved through her, starting at her shoulders and working outward and downward, and she absorbed it, and it was enormous, and she was still standing. Then the second wave. This one was different. It started low, below her ribs, in the center of her abdomen, and it was not the baby moving. She knew what the baby felt like now. She'd had 23 weeks of learning the specific vocabulary of his communication. This was different, a tightening that came from the outside in, and it was strong, and it was accompanied by something warm and immediate that registered in her body a second before her brain caught up with what it meant. She put her hand on Gideon's arm. He looked at her immediately, sharply. The way someone looks when the person beside them has changed suddenly. Elara, she stopped, breathed through it. I need you to get the car. He was already moving. Get the car, she said, right now. But before the car could come, before Gideon could get through the crowd to the exit, she felt her legs begin to make a decision that had nothing to do with her willingness, and she put her hand on the banister of the staircase and held it with everything she had and looked for somewhere to be. That wasn't the middle of a ballroom floor. And the tightening came again, harder this time, and the warmth became something she couldn't categorize as anything other than wrong. And she thought with a clarity that was almost calm, not yet, not here, not now, and her body said, with the absolute indifference of a physical reality that did not negotiate with willpower or timing or the particular demands of a legal strategy, 3 weeks in the making. Yes, now. The car never came. Gideon made it 6 steps into the crowd before he turned back, because he had been watching her face when he turned away, and what he'd seen in it was enough to override every other calculation. He came back through the people who moved for him instinctively the way people move when someone is moving with that particular purpose, and he put his hand under her arm and said her name, and she heard it from a distance, the way you hear things when your body has decided, something that your mind is still arguing with. I can walk, she said. I know you can. Don't carry me. Don't make a scene. I'm not making a scene. He wasn't. He was simply there, solid and present, guiding her toward the side exit with the practiced discretion of a man who had moved through difficult moments in public spaces before and understood that dignity in a crisis is mostly about direction and pace. She focused on her feet, one and then the other, the carpet under her heels, and then the marble of the lobby, and then the cold air of the side entrance that hit her face like something necessary. The car was there by the time they got outside. Not the same car. Gideon had called a different one, or the doorman had, or someone had made a decision she hadn't been part of. It didn't matter. The door was open, and she got in, and he got in beside her, and told the driver the hospital, and the city began moving past the windows. She gripped the door handle. The tightening came again, worse this time, and she breathed through it the way she'd been trying to breathe for 3 weeks, deliberate, conscious, a choice. And this time her body refused the frame, and she made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Something involuntary and raw that she would have been embarrassed by 25 days ago and had no energy to be embarrassed by now. Talk to me, Gideon said. I'm fine. You just made a sound that, I'm fine, she said again. And she meant it in the only way she could mean it. Right then, not that she wasn't in pain, not that nothing was wrong, but that she was still here and still herself and still the person who had walked down that staircase 20 minutes ago. And that person was going to stay intact through this, the way she'd stayed intact through everything else. The board, she said. Elara, tell me about the board. Where they are. What's happening upstairs? He looked at her for a moment, assessing. Then he understood that she needed this, that it was functional and not avoidance, that keeping her mind moving was the specific mechanism by which she was managing the rest of her body right now. Tom Chen texted 3 minutes ago, he said. The full board is convened. Prentice is in the room. He doesn't know about the Swiss documentation yet. The car moved through a red light. The driver had turned on his hazards without being asked. Damian, she said, in the room. His attorney tried to accompany him and the board declined. Damian went in alone. A pause. That was always going to happen. A board in crisis doesn't want attorneys in the room. They want principals. She nodded. The tightening moved through her and she pressed her back against the seat and breathed and came out the other side of it and kept talking because talking was the thing she could control. When Prentice sees the Swiss correspondence, he'll request a recess. He'll want to call his attorney. The board will either grant it or they won't. Holloway has the discretion as acting chair. Gideon's voice was steady, calibrated to hers. But the documentation exists, regardless of what happens in that room tonight. The SEC referral goes out tomorrow morning, regardless. The criminal exposure is there regardless. So tonight is the board removing him from any position of authority before he can do anything else with it. He paused. That's already done. Elara. The moment Holloway opened that package this morning, it was done. The hospital came into view. She looked at it through the window, the lit entrance, the ambulance bay, the ordinary urgent machinery of a place that existed specifically for moments when the body decided to override everything else. And she thought, fleetingly, absurdly, about the baby shoes in a box in the bedroom closet, small and white and still wrapped in tissue paper. She thought about that, and something cracked in her chest that had been holding for 3 weeks, and she put her hand over her mouth and kept it there until it passed. It passed. The car stopped. The hospital moved fast once they understood the situation. 23 weeks. Significant contractions, possible placental involvement. The doctor on call, using words she absorbed and filed away, and didn't allow herself to fully wait until she was in a room and on a monitor, and someone had confirmed what was happening with the specificity that made it real rather than theoretical. The OB who came in was a woman named Dr. Ewan, 50s, with the manner of someone who had delivered enough emergencies to know that panic was a luxury and information was a tool, and the most useful thing she could do for this patient right now was tell her exactly what she was dealing with. "You have a partial placental abruption," Dr. Ewan said, reading from the ultrasound with the focused calm of someone naming a problem they've named before. "The separation is not complete. Baby's heart rate is stressed, but within a range we can work with. You're 23 weeks and 4 days. We're going to give you medication to slow the contractions and steroids for lung development, and then we're going to make a decision about delivery based on how your body responds in the next 2 hours. And if it doesn't respond," Elara said, "then we deliver tonight, doctor." Yun looked at her directly. "Either way, this baby is coming significantly early. What we're trying to determine right now is whether we can buy more time. How much more time makes a difference? Every day at this stage makes a difference. 2 weeks makes a substantial difference." A pause. "But I need you to understand that 23 weeks is a viable gestational age at this hospital. We have a level 4 NICU. If we deliver tonight, the odds are not what any of us choose, but they are not what they were even 10 years ago." Elara heard all of it. She looked at the monitor beside her, the line that was her son's heartbeat, moving across the screen in its uneven, urgent rhythm. And she thought about the night she'd called Sabrina at 11 p.m. and said the test was positive, and the way the baby had moved under her hand on the floor of Patricia's storage unit when she'd said we're figuring it out, and the way she'd told him in the dark of the guest room we're going to be fine. She had meant it. She meant it still. "Do what you need to do," she said to Dr. Yoon. "I trust you." Dr. Yoon nodded and began issuing instructions to the nurses. And the room organized itself around the crisis, with the competent choreography of people who had trained for exactly this. And Elara lay in the center of it, money, with the monitor line drawing her son's heartbeat across the screen, and she let them work. She had done her work. Now someone else had to do theirs. Damian arrived at 11:47. She knew it was him before she saw him, because she heard his voice in the hallway, not the content. Just the register, the specific frequency she'd memorized over 12 years of knowing him in every room he'd ever occupied. He was talking to someone at the nurse's station, and his voice was doing the thing it did when he was trying to be controlled and the control was costing him something. She'd told the nurse to let him in, not because she'd forgiven him, not because the board meeting and the documents and the declaration had ceased to matter, because he was the father of the child whose heartbeat was on that monitor, and she was not the kind of person who used a medical emergency as a weapon, even against someone who deserved a great deal of what was coming to him. He came through the door and stopped. He looked at the monitor first, at the line, at the number in the corner that was their son's heart rate. She watched him absorb it, watched the specific way a person's face changes when they understand, for the first time, in a visceral rather than abstract way, that something real is at stake. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her bed, without asking if he could, which was the right instinct. He looked at her. He looked bad, worse than the Meridian Club this morning. His tie was gone. His jacket was gone. There was a quality to his face that she recognized as the aftermath of something institutional and final, the face of a man who had been in a room where the thing he'd built had been formally taken from him, and who had then been told his wife was in the hospital, and who had covered the distance between those two facts in whatever time it had taken to get across the city. "How is he?" Damian said. "Stress stable. They're trying to buy time. And you, the same. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and sat like that for a moment. She watched him. She was not unmoved by it. That was the complicated truth of the night. She was not unmoved, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending was the thing she'd run out of the ability to do somewhere between the courthouse steps and the ballroom staircase and the car with the hazard lights on. The board meeting, she said. He lifted his head. His eyes were red at the rims. They removed me, he said. Unanimous. Effective immediately. They're referring the financial evidence to the SEC and to the DA's office. A pause. Prentice resigned when Chen put the Swiss transfer on the table. He didn't even argue. He looked at the paper, and he said he needed to call his attorney, and Holloway said he could call his attorney from outside the room, and that was it. And Damian's voice, when he said, it was the voice of someone reporting the results of a game they'd played and lost, and were still processing the reality of losing. I told them the full amount, he said, in the room, before they asked. Gideon had the preliminary figures I gave them, the real number. She looked at him. Why? Because I was going to tell it anyway. He exhaled. Because it was the only thing left in that room that I could choose to do. He paused. 88 million. Across the full period. The monitor beeped steadily. And Sabrina, she said. Her declaration was in the package. He said Sabrina's name with a flatness that told her more than any emotional register would have. She cooperated. Her attorney confirmed. Whatever deal she made, that's between her and whoever she made it with. She made it with my attorney. He nodded. Slowly. She's gone then, he said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. The night she told me you were pregnant, he said, and then stopped. Elara waited. She called me, he said, after you called her. That same night, after you'd already told her. She called me and told me, and He stopped again. I didn't come home. I told her I needed time to think about what it meant. And she said, take whatever time you need. He looked at the floor. That's the night I should have come home. The room was very quiet. Yes, Elara said. It was. She wasn't going to give him more than that. Not tonight. The honesty of the admission was real. She believed he meant it, and it changed nothing about what had happened. In the months between that night and this one, and she was too tired to pretend that meaning something and being enough were the same thing. A nurse came in to check the monitor readings, made a note, said something brief and professional, and left. When she was gone, Elara said, I need you to understand something about what happens after tonight. Damian looked at her. You're going to face significant legal consequences. I don't know the shape of them yet. I don't know how long or what specifically. Those are decisions that are going to be made by people who aren't me. She kept her voice level. I'm not going to be your advocate in those proceedings. I can't be and I won't be. I know, but I'm also not going to be your enemy in them. I'm going to be Miles's mother. That's my entire position going forward. She paused. If you want to be his father, a real one, in whatever form that takes, given what the next few years look like, then you do the work of being that. Not as a negotiation, not as something you use to access me, just as what it is. He nodded, his jaw was tight. And you need to understand, she said, that the woman who stands beside you when you walk into a room, who makes your deals work and keeps your company from falling apart and stays invisible, so your name can be on everything, she's gone. She doesn't exist anymore. Whatever you're going to be after this, you're going to have to be it yourself. Something moved across his face. Not the shame from the Meridian Club. Older than that. The specific grief of a person who has just been told, clearly and without cruelty, that the thing they lost was larger than they understood while they had it. I know, he said for the third time. And she believed him. That was the part that would stay complicated for a long time, not the betrayal. Not the documents, not the $88 million. The fact that she believed him, and it wasn't enough, and she was at peace with both of those things being true simultaneously. Dr. Yun came back at 2 in the morning. Miles Quinn arrived at 4:41 a.m. He was small, the kind of small that stops your breath when you first see it. The specific smallness of someone who arrived before they were supposed to and is working very hard at the business of existing with lungs that hadn't had quite enough time to finish. He was 2 pounds and 11 ounces, and he had dark hair like his father, and a way of holding his hands in fists at his sides like he was preparing for something. And when Elara first saw him through the glass of the NICU, She put both palms flat against it and stood there for a long time. She couldn't hold him yet. That would come later days later, when he was stronger, when the numbers on his monitors moved in the directions they needed to move. For now, he was in his isolette with his leads and his lines, and the specific urgent competence of a NICU staff that talked to him while they worked, using his name, telling him what they were doing, the small human courtesy of it, breaking something open in Elara's chest that she hadn't known was still closed. She had named him Miles Quinn, not Damian's suggestion, which had been offered gently in the hallway before the delivery and had been a name she'd liked, genuinely, before this month. She chose Miles because her father's middle name was Miles, and her father had been the first person who'd taught her that being thorough was not a personality flaw, but a form of love. And she chose Quinn because Quinn was the name she'd been born with, the name she was going back to, the name that had existed before Damian Vale, and would exist after him. She stood at the glass and watched her son breathe. Damian stood beside her. Not close, there was a foot of space between them, appropriate and real but present. He was looking at Miles with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, and she recognized it because she'd felt its equivalent in herself when she'd first seen the heartbeat on the monitor. The expression of someone who understands, viscerally and for the first time, that some things are not negotiable, that there are people you do not get to be strategic about. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Damian said quietly, "He looks like he's angry about something." Elara looked at her son's small-fisted hands. "He has a lot to be angry about," she said. He arrived early, a brief silence. "He's going to be okay," Damian said. And then, before she could respond, "I'm not saying that to make you feel better. I'm saying it because he looks like you." She looked at Miles for another long moment. "Go home, Damian," she said. "Get some sleep. Come back tomorrow when visiting hours start." He nodded. He didn't argue, she noted it the right choice. She heard him walk away down the corridor. She stayed at the glass. The legal proceedings took 11 months. There was a federal investigation, 3 separate civil suits from Vale Meridian's institutional investors, and eventually a criminal indictment that covered financial fraud, wire fraud, and a securities violation connected to the Prentice arrangement. Prentice pleaded guilty. First, his attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement within 2 weeks of the board meeting, and his testimony filled in the portions of the financial structure that even Patricia's team hadn't been able to fully document. He received a fine and a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation, and the permanent surrender of any role in any publicly traded company. Damian's proceedings took longer. He did not cooperate in the way. Prentice did not immediately, not easily. He fought on several fronts, simultaneously through the winter and into the spring, and Gideon told her at one point that Damian's legal strategy was the strategy of a man who understood he was going to lose, but needed to arrive at the loss on his own terms. She understood that. It was not so different in its way from who he'd always been. He pleaded guilty in May to 2 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of securities violation. The sentence was 42 months in a federal facility in Connecticut, with restitution requirements that consumed the majority of his liquid assets. His corporate assets were liquidated under a court-supervised process that used the proceeds to partially satisfy the shareholder claims. She was not in the courtroom when he was sentenced. She had Miles by then had Miles for 7 months. Though the first 3 of those months he had spent in the NICU, getting strong enough to come home in increments so small they were sometimes invisible until they were suddenly enormous. She was home with Miles on the day of the sentencing, sitting on the floor of his nursery while he slept, reading the verdict on her phone with the sound off so as not to wake him. She put the phone down. She sat with it for a moment. Then she put the phone face down on the carpet and watched her son sleep. He was small, but he was strong. The NICU team had said that from the beginning, he's a fighter, this one, which was a thing NICU nurses said to parents because it was true, and because parents needed to hear it, and in Miles's case it had been true in ways that made Elara's hands shake when she thought about his first 3 weeks. He was 7 months old now, and he fit against her shoulder in a way that felt specific to him, a particular weight and warmth, and the way he grabbed her hair without understanding he was doing it. She had learned his vocabulary, the specific sounds he made when he was hungry versus when he was just bored. The way his face changed when he was about to fall asleep, the the way he looked at light sources, with an expression of absolute concentration, as if he was taking notes. She loved him in a way that was completely without strategy. It was the most uncomplicated thing in her life, and she understood that was partly because everything else had been so complicated for so long that the simplicity of it felt enormous by contrast. She was not going to examine it too closely. Some things were allowed to be what they were. Sabrina's chapter closed quietly. Her cooperation agreement had protected her from Vale Meridian civil suits, but she forfeited the 2 properties purchased through Cross Meridian Holdings and the assets acquired through the Vantage payments. She left New York in February. Elara didn't know where she went and didn't ask. A mutual acquaintance mentioned once that Sabrina had relocated to the Pacific Northwest. Elara said that was nice and moved the conversation forward. In March, a handwritten letter arrived through Gideon's office. 4 pages, Sabrina's handwriting. She'd always had the handwriting of someone who'd been told as a child that handwriting mattered, the kind of deliberate cursive that took effort. She wrote about the night she'd driven over in her pajamas. She wrote about the things Damian had told her, and the things she'd chosen to believe, and the things she'd known were not true, but had decided, in the specific self-deceiving way of people who want something badly enough, to treat as true anyway. She wrote that she had no explanation for the bracelet that made it anything other than what it was. She did not ask for forgiveness. That was the thing Elara noted, reading it at her kitchen table with Miles asleep in the next room. Sabrina knew her well enough, even now, to know that asking was not the point. The letter was not a request. It was a document, a record of what she understood she had done, offered without expectation, because some things needed to be said aloud, even if saying them changed nothing. Elara read it once, sitting very still. She placed it in a drawer. She did not respond. She did not forgive Sabrina. She had thought about that, had turned it over in the nights when Miles was sleeping, and she had nothing to occupy her hands, and her mind went where minds go when there's nothing to manage. Forgiveness had a specific meaning for her, and it wasn't the performance of a feeling she didn't have. It was something that happened or didn't, in its own time, without being forced. Maybe it would happen, eventually. Maybe the letter would be the first layer of something that accumulated slowly into something else. She didn't know. She wasn't going to decide in advance. What she decided was simpler than forgiveness. She decided to put it down. Not Sabrina, not the specific weight of what Sabrina had done. The broader thing. The version of herself that had spent years being invisible, years being useful in ways that weren't counted, years trusting in a way that hadn't been protected. She wasn't going to carry that into the next part of her life and call it a lesson. Lessons implied the damage was instructional. This was not instructional. It was just damage, and she had survived it. And now she was going to do the thing that came after surviving, which was build. The Quinn Initiative held its inaugural benefit in October. Miles was 11 months old. He was home with a sitter that Elara had interviewed with the same thoroughness she'd brought to contract negotiation. And she'd called twice during the cocktail hour, and both times the sitter had answered on the second ring and reported that he was fine, and she needed to put her phone away. The venue was a converted loft in Tribeca, smaller than a Meridian Grand Ballroom, deliberately. She hadn't wanted chandeliers. She'd wanted good light and real tables and the specific energy of a room full of people who were still building something, who were in the middle of it, rather than at the top of it, who understood what it felt like to do work that other people's names ended up on. She stood at the front of the room in a dark navy dress and looked out at 200 faces and thought about what she actually wanted to say, because she'd written a speech and had decided on the drive over that she wasn't going to give it. "I spent 10 years being very good at something," she said, "and making sure no one knew it was me." The room was quiet. I told myself it was practical, that the work mattered more than the credit, that building something real was enough, regardless of whose name was on it. She paused. I was wrong. Not about the work mattering. The work does matter, but the name matters too. Because if your name isn't attached to what you build, then the person whose name is attached gets to decide what your contribution was worth. And they will always decide it was worth less than it was. She looked at the faces. The Quinn Initiative exists because I believe the most dangerous thing that can happen to a talented person is not failure. It's invisibility. It's doing extraordinary work and being managed into obscurity by the people who needed what you could do, but couldn't afford to acknowledge it. She stopped. I know what that feels like from the inside. I'm not interested in it anymore. A pause. If you're in this room, it's because someone on my team looked at your work and said this person is doing something real and not getting credit for it. And we want to change that. She looked out at the 200 faces. So let's change it. The room applauded. She stepped back from the podium, and Gideon, who was standing to the side with a glass of water he'd been holding for her since the start of the evening, handed it to her, and she drank it, and he said quietly, "That was better than the speech." "I know," she said. "You always know. That's the thing," she said. "I always knew. I just wasn't saying it in rooms where it counted." He looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize over 11 months as his version of approval, which was a particular quality of stillness that meant he was done evaluating and had arrived at a conclusion. The Foundation has 3 applications from founders who previously contracted with Vale Meridian, he said. 2 of them are women who did work that appeared in the company's portfolio under different names. "I know. I flagged them." "Of course you did." She looked out at the room, the conversations. Starting up again, the energy of 200 people who'd been given permission to believe their work was worth backing, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not the aftermath of crisis. Something quieter and more durable than either of those. She felt like herself, not the version of herself that had stood beside Damian Vale for 10 years, useful and invisible. Not the version that had sat on the floor of a storage unit and talked to her unborn son and made lists of what had been stolen from her. The version that existed before all of it. The one who'd been 28 years old, full of people who were underestimating her, who had read the room and known exactly which thread to pull, who had understood that the most significant kind of power was the kind that operated without announcing itself. That version had survived. She'd been wondering, in the quiet moments, the 3 a.m. moments with Miles asleep on her chest and the city outside the window, whether that person was still in there, whether the weight of the past year had compressed her into something smaller and more careful, whether she had traded some essential part of herself for the ability to get through it. She had not. She was, if anything, more completely herself than she had been before. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. It seemed like the kind of thing that was better demonstrated than articulated. So she put down the water glass and moved back into the room and started talking to the people in it. The founders, the investors she'd carefully selected, the 2 women whose work had ended up in Vale Meridian's portfolio under different names, and she listened to them, the way she'd always listened, with the specific quality of attention that made people feel their ideas were being taken seriously, because they were. At 9:30, she stepped outside for 10 minutes. The October air was cold and clean. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the piece of Manhattan sky visible between buildings and let her body be still for a moment. Her feet ached. Miles was probably asleep by now. She had 31 new emails, and she was not going to look at them until tomorrow. She reached into the small bag she'd carried and took out her phone and called the sitter, who answered on the second ring and said he was perfect. He'd gone down at 8 without fussing. He was fine. She thanked her and hung up. She put the phone back in the bag. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and breathed. The city moved around her, the way it always had its magnificent, indifferent, ongoing motion. All those people in all those buildings doing all their invisible, necessary things. The ordinary, overwhelming machinery of a place that had no idea and no interest in what Cincy's single person inside it had been through. She had always found that comforting, rather than alienating. The city's indifference was honest. It didn't assign meaning. It just continued, and you moved through it, and the meaning was yours to make or not. She went back inside. Later that night, after the event, after the car and the elevator, and the checking on Miles the way she always checked on him, hand on his back to feel him breathe, standing there for longer than was strictly necessary, she went to the bedroom and to the shelf in the closet where she'd placed the box. She opened it. The bracelet was inside. Rose gold and 3 oval diamonds, her mother's, her grandmother's, the thing that had been on Sabrina's wrist under a chandelier while Elara ate soup alone on a Friday night. She'd gotten it back through the asset forfeiture process. Gideon had flagged it specifically, an inheritance with documented provenance, not subject to restitution. It had come back to her in a padded envelope in February, and she'd put it in this box, and she hadn't put it on. She looked at it now. She thought about her mother, who had worn it every day for 30 years, and had given it to Elara 2 weeks before she died, with the specific decisiveness of a woman who wanted to settle her accounts while she still could. She thought about what her mother would have said about the past year. Not about Damian. She'd never entirely trusted Damian, which she'd expressed exactly once and then set aside because it wasn't her life. About Elara, about the choices she'd made and the ones she hadn't, and the version of herself she'd found on the other side of the wreckage. She thought her mother would have said, "I always knew you were in there." She picked up the bracelet. She put it on, not as a reclamation or a ceremony or a statement about survival, just because it was hers, and it had always been hers, and she was ready to wear it again. She walked down the hallway to Miles's room. He was asleep on his back with his arms out to the sides in the complete physical abandon of babies who do not yet understand the vulnerability of that position. His face was peaceful in the way that always stopped her, the absolute, uncomplicated trust of a person who had not yet learned that the world required strategy. She would not teach him that. That was the decision she had made in the NICU, watching his small chest rise and fall. The specific decision that had organized itself out of everything that had happened and arrived fully formed on a morning when she was running on 4 hours of sleep and a hospital breakfast. She would not teach him to be useful at the expense of being known. She would teach him that his name mattered, that the work his hands made should carry his name. That trust was not weakness, but it was not unlimited either, and the difference between the two was worth learning young. She stood in the doorway of the nursery, with the bracelet on her wrist and the city's ambient light coming through the curtains, and her son sleeping with his arms wide open, and she looked at him for a long time. The most dangerous mistake a person can make, she'd said at the podium tonight, was allowing someone else's betrayal to determine the rest of their life. She believed it. She was going to spend the rest of her life proving it. She reached in and tucked the blanket more securely around his feet, because his feet always came out from under the blanket, some law of baby physics she'd given up trying to understand. He didn't wake. He shifted slightly and made a sound that was not a word but communicated, with complete clarity, that he was warm and full and where he was supposed to be. She turned off the lamp. She stood in the doorway one more moment. Then she walked out into the rest of her life, and she did not look back, and she did not need to.